March 7, 1945. Just before 1 in the afternoon, scouts from the 89th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron reach the ridge above Remagen and look down at the Rhine. What they radio back to Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman stops him cold. The bridge is still there. The Ludendorff Railroad Bridge, a double-tracked steel structure built during the First World War and named for the German general who championed its construction, sits intact across 270 meters of cold, fast-moving Rhine water. German soldiers and vehicles are still crossing it. Planks have been laid over the railroad tracks to let wheeled vehicles pass. The retreat is in full progress, and the bridge is still standing. Engerman arrives at the ridge, confirms it through his own field glasses, and does not hesitate. He calls forward Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, a 22-year-old from West Point, Nebraska, who has been in command of Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion for less than 24 hours. He gives him an order so unlikely it sounds almost like a mistake: take the bridge. What followed over the next 18 days is one of the most concentrated engineering operations in the history of the United States Army. American combat engineers, working under artillery fire, aerial bombardment, floating mines, and the first ballistic missiles ever aimed at a battlefield target, kept a crossing over the Rhine open long enough to push more than 125,000 soldiers, tanks, artillery, and trucks across the last major natural barrier into Germany. The Germans, in their desperation to close what they immediately recognized as a wound that could end the war, threw every weapon they possessed at a single bridge. They sent jet bombers. They sent frogmen. They sent a 600mm siege mortar. And then, in a moment that has no precedent in the history of warfare, they redirected their V-2 rockets, the most advanced ballistic missiles on Earth, away from the cities they had been hitting for months, and aimed them at a bridge in a German river town. They missed. The engineers kept working. And the Western War in Europe was shorter by at least 3 weeks because of what happened at Remagen. To understand why a single bridge at a place nobody had planned to cross became the moment the German defense of the West broke open, you have to go back not to the morning of March 7, but to a strategic picture so rigid, so locked in its own assumptions, that it very nearly caused the Americans to walk past the opportunity entirely. The Rhine is not an ordinary river. It runs for roughly 766 miles, and along its central stretch through Germany it is wide, swift, deep, and cold enough in March to kill an unprotected man in the water within minutes. Since the time of the Roman Empire, it has served as the natural defensive boundary of the German interior. In the first months of 1945, it was the last serious obstacle standing between the collapsing German army and total defeat on its own soil. Adolf Hitler understood this perfectly. He had given standing orders that Rhine bridges were to be demolished the moment Allied forces came within 8 kilometers, and only then, and only by explicit written authorization. The logic was sound on paper. Blow the bridges too early, and you strand your own retreating forces on the wrong bank. Blow them too late, and you hand the enemy a crossing. The Germans had managed this balance successfully at every other crossing point, except one. The Allied plan for crossing the Rhine in the spring of 1945 was Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's carefully designed set-piece assault, planned for the night of March 23 to 24 near Wesel in the north. Generals Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower were supporting it. Nobody in Allied operational planning was thinking about Remagen, a town of roughly 5,000 people sitting in a steep gorge with a ridge called the Erpeler Lay rising sharply on the far eastern bank. The terrain beyond that ridge was considered tactically discouraging. High ground, narrow roads, no obvious avenue into Germany's interior. The reason the Rhine mattered so much to both sides by March of 1945 was not abstract. On the western bank, the Allies had cleared most of Germany's remaining defensive lines. On the eastern bank lay the Ruhr, the concentrated heart of what remained of the German war economy, the coal mines and steel mills and armaments factories that had kept Germany fighting since 1939. Without the Ruhr's output, the Wehrmacht could not be sustained. Without a Rhine crossing, the Ruhr could not be encircled. The Allies knew it. Hitler knew it. Every German soldier still fighting knew it. The Rhine was not just a river barrier. It was the wall between Germany's industrial survival and its industrial collapse, which is exactly why, on the afternoon of March 7, the bridge was still standing. The Ludendorff Bridge had been built between 1916 and 1919, largely by Russian prisoners of war, to move German troops and supplies to the Western Front of the First World War. Those Russian prisoners, it would turn out, had done their work extraordinarily well. The German demolition team tasked with destroying it in March of 1945 would spend the final hours of the bridge's existence discovering just how well. The story of why the demolitions failed is not simply a story about American luck. It is a story about what Hitler's own orders had done to German command discipline at exactly the wrong moment. Earlier in the war, a German officer had triggered a Rhine Bridge demolition prematurely, destroying it while German troops were still crossing. The incident enraged Hitler. He had issued a standing order requiring that explosive charges be removed from bridge structures and stored separately until the enemy was close, to prevent panicked junior officers from destroying bridges that still had operational value. Detonation then required explicit written authorization from a responsible officer. The intent was to preserve Germany's retreat infrastructure. The effect at Remagen, when American tanks appeared above the town ahead of anyone's expectations, was paralysis. On the morning of March 7, Captain Willy Brach, the German officer nominally responsible for defending the bridge, was managing a collapsing situation with a force that included a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft unit, a company of combat engineers under Captain Karl Timmermann, a rocket launcher battery, several hundred Volkssturm militia, and a mass of Eastern European labourers. The bridge charges had been stored off the structure entirely, as required by Hitler's standing order. Getting them back in place while a retreating army was still crossing the planks, under American observation and approaching fire, was going to take time that did not exist. Major Hans Scheller, sent by Corps headquarters to take command of the situation, arrived at 11:15 in the morning. Both he and Friesenhahn inspected the western end of the bridge within minutes of his arrival. What neither of them knew was that the American task force was already fighting its way through the streets of Remagen, less than a mile from where they were standing. The German position at the bridge that morning was, in the plainest possible terms, a shambles. The total force of roughly 1,000 men included almost no one who could be described as a trained combat soldier. The Volkssturm militia were elderly men and teenagers. The Eastern European labourers were civilians under German compulsion with no stake in the outcome. 180 Hitlerjugend, boys in their early teens, had been pressed into service at the bridge fortifications. The Luftwaffe anti-aircraft crews answered to their own chain of command, not to Brach or Scheller. The combat engineers under Friesenhahn numbered only 125 men and were competent at demolition work, not infantry fighting. This force was supposed to hold a critical Rhine crossing against an American armoured division that had just broken through the Siegfried Line. The demolition situation was no better. Friesenhahn had requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosives for the bridge charges. He received 300 kilograms of Donnerit, a commercial ammonium nitrate compound used in civilian mining operations, significantly weaker than military TNT. The full demolition system had been wired to fire 60 separate charges simultaneously from a single control circuit located in the tunnel beneath the Erpel Allee on the east bank. The electrical cables connecting the firing circuit to the charge positions ran through protective steel pipes along the bridge structure and were exposed to artillery fire on the approaches. The Allied bombing campaign had already struck the bridge and its surroundings repeatedly in the preceding months, including a raid by B-24 bombers as recently as March 5. Friesenhahn's engineers placed what charges they could under the circumstances. At roughly 3 in the afternoon, with American tanks visible at the western bridge approach, they triggered a preliminary charge under the western ramp. It blew a crater approximately 30 feet across in the approach roadway and halted vehicle traffic. The Americans paused, watching the main span, waiting for it to drop. It did not drop. The main demolition charge, intended to bring the central span down into the Rhine, failed to detonate. The electrical firing circuit had been cut, most likely by American artillery fire on the approach roads. Friesenhahn's men tried to restore the connection under fire, and could not. They fell back on a manual backup detonator, a hand-cranked device. Friesenhahn himself worked the crank. A smaller emergency charge fired. The bridge shuddered and appeared to lift from its piers. Then it settled back down, still standing, still crossable. The pier charges had been packed with Donnerit rather than military TNT. Weaker than anything, an intact railway bridge built to military specifications could be expected to fail against with a single damaged firing circuit. The Russians, who had built it between 1916 and 1919, had built it to outlast what was being asked of it that afternoon. At 3:30 in the afternoon of March 7, 1945, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann received the order to assault the bridge with his company. He had been born in Frankfurt am Main 22 years earlier, the son of an American occupation soldier of German ancestry who had gone absent without leave from his post at Koblenz in 1919, married a German woman, and eventually found a way to bring his young family back to the United States when Karl was barely a year and a half old. The Timmermans settled in West Point, Nebraska. Karl had enlisted in the Army in 1940, earned his commission at Fort Benning, Georgia in February of 1943, and was now standing at the western end of a railroad bridge in the country of his birth, looking at open water on either side of a structure that might still be demolished at any moment. He asked his battalion commander if he was expected to cross a bridge that could be blown under him. The answer was essentially yes. Timmermann looked at his men, then he led them onto the bridge at a run, down the middle of the span. What followed was not an orderly military assault. It was a company of American infantrymen moving as fast as they could across a surface covered in loose planking laid over railroad tracks, over open water, under fire from stone towers on both ends, with demolition wires running along the sides of the structure that the engineers among them were cutting as fast as they could find them. Shell fragments were coming off the stone towers and the latticed steel of the truss above. A man who went down on the planking went down on railroad steel above a long drop to the Rhine below. Lieutenant Hugh Mott and Sergeants Eugene Dorland and John Reynolds of Company B of the 9th Armoured Engineer Battalion ran alongside the infantry, cutting demolition wires as they found them and kicking boxes of unexploded charges into the river below. Lieutenant Mott found the main demolition cable and, finding it too thick to cut with pliers, used his carbine to shoot it in two. Timmermann was hit by shrapnel in the arm at some point during the crossing. He did not stop. He kept his men moving, kept himself visible, kept the assault going forward. Sergeant Alexander Drabik of Holland, Ohio, reached the east bank first. He later described what the crossing was like in words that have been on record since 1945. "We ran down the middle of the bridge, shouting as we went," he said. "I did not stop because I knew that if I kept moving they could not hit me. My men were in squad column, and not one of them was hit." Drabik and his squad took cover in bomb craters on the eastern bank and held their position, waiting for the rest of the company to come across. He was the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine in combat since the army of Napoleon had done it in the early 19th century. Timmermann reached the east bank seconds after Drabik, becoming the first American officer across. By 3:45, the eastern end of the bridge was in American hands. Major Scheller, understanding what had happened, ordered one final demolition attempt on the eastern charge. The explosion lifted the main span slightly. It came back down still on its piers, still crossable. Scheller fled toward Corps headquarters by bicycle to seek new orders. He was arrested, court-martialed, and shot in the back of the neck in a forest a few days later, executed alongside 3 other officers the court had convicted for failing to destroy the bridge. Friesenhahn, who had done everything technically possible with the materials his own army had given him, stood before the same court and was acquitted. The news of the intact crossing reached Brigadier General William Hoge, commanding Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division, within minutes. Hoge had not been authorized to cross the Rhine. Nobody had authorized him to cross the Rhine. The terrain on the far side was not what Allied planners had selected for a crossing point. He had no orders covering this situation. He crossed anyway, and reported what he had done as he did it. The chain of calls that followed went from Hoge to Major General John Milliken of 3rd Corps, to Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges of 1st Army, to Omar Bradley, to Eisenhower. The reaction at each level accelerated. Eisenhower, reached at his headquarters, was described by those present as genuinely elated. The order that came back down the chain was immediate. "Hold it. Get everything across it. The speed of the American response in the hours that followed was as remarkable as the capture itself. Within hours of Hoge's decision to commit, 1st Army Headquarters was redirecting engineer battalions, pontoon equipment, anti-aircraft batteries, and additional infantry divisions toward a town that had not appeared on any priority list that morning. The two roads leading into Remagen from the west and south were choked for miles with equipment, hundreds of amphibious trucks, bridging sections, anti-aircraft gun, half-tracks, and thousands of troops funneled toward a single crossing point by a logistical system that had been given no advance notice and no operational plan. By the end of March 8, 1st Army had begun attaching additional engineer units to 3rd Corps specifically for the Remagen bridgehead. By March 9, 5 anti-aircraft battalions were in position. By March 10, 3 heavy pontoon battalions, 2 treadway companies, and a DUKW amphibious truck company had been redirected to Remagen. None of this had existed in any operational order 24 hours earlier. The night before all of it, on March 6, Major General Milliken and Major General John Leonard of the 9th Armoured Division had been talking by telephone, both of them looking at their maps. Milliken had said something that Leonard would not forget. He had a question for him, Milliken said. Did Leonard see that little black strip of bridge at Remagen? If they happened to get it, he said, Leonard's name would go down in glory. Neither man had any realistic expectation the bridge would still be standing when Engermann's task force reached the river the following afternoon. It had been noted as a possibility and set aside as improbable. They had been planning the Rhine like an obstacle to be forced, not a door left open. What nobody on either side of the Rhine fully grasped in those first hours was that the bridge was already dying. The German demolition charge had failed to bring down the main span, but it had nonetheless broken the bottom chord of the upstream arch truss, almost directly over the North River pier, forcing that section 4 inches out of alignment. The bridge was structurally compromised from the moment the Americans took it. It was carrying continuous military traffic it had not been designed to carry, across a span that had been partially fractured before the first American boot touched its planking. Every tank that rolled across, every loaded ammunition truck, every column of infantry, was adding load to a structure that was failing in ways no surface inspection could detect. Lieutenant Colonel Clayton Rust, commander of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, arrived with his men on the morning of March 10 and relieved the 9th Armoured Engineer Company that had been keeping the bridge open since the capture. Rust was a trained engineer. He walked the bridge, studied the structural damage as carefully as conditions allowed, and understood immediately that what his men were being asked to do bore no resemblance to standard bridge repair work. His goal was not to restore the Ludendorff to full strength. His goal was to keep it from collapsing long enough for enough forces to cross that the bridgehead would be irreversible regardless of what happened to the span. He later captured this mission in a single sentence in his after-action report. Restoration of the bridge to full strength was not intended. The immediate goal was sufficient strength to support the dead load and one-way traffic. He set his men to work under conditions that had no precedent in any engineering training manual. The bridge was carrying continuous heavy military traffic while they worked on it. German artillery was landing on and around the crossing at unpredictable intervals. The superstructure above the working positions was being struck by shrapnel that sent steel fragments through the open work areas without warning. The Rhine below was cold enough and fast enough that a man who fell in while carrying tools and wearing full field gear had, in the estimates of the engineers themselves, very little chance of surviving long enough to be pulled out. The first task was clearing the approach ramp crater so vehicles could reach the bridge deck. A tank equipped with a bulldozer blade pushed rubble aside while engineers laid steel treadways over the remaining gaps in the roadway surface, under direct fire. That work alone, accomplished in the hours immediately following the capture before any reinforcing engineer units had arrived, earned the men who did it a permanent place in the operational record of American combat engineering. The bridge structure itself was a different order of problem. Rust's after-action report describes the upstream truss damage in precise technical terms. The demolition charge had completely destroyed a critical panel joint in the upstream truss almost directly over the North River pier, forcing the truss 4 inches below the level of the downstream truss at the corresponding point. This meant the downstream truss was now carrying load that both trusses had been designed to share equally. The entire bridge was under a twisting stress it had not been engineered to sustain, and that stress was increasing with every vehicle that crossed. Rust's engineers could not replace the broken cord in field conditions. What they could do was reinforce what remained, add timber decking to spread vehicle loads more evenly across the compromised span, and splice the damaged vertical hangers with turnbuckles and cable to slow the progressive structural failure. Every one of these tasks meant men with cutting torches and wrenches working in the open on a bridge, vibrating from both traffic above and artillery impacts nearby, cutting steel and welding replacement sections while shells were landing within a short distance of where they stood. The engineers were also fighting a bureaucratic battle alongside the structural one. General Millikin could not close the bridge to traffic until the alternative crossings downstream were operational. That meant Rust's men were repairing a structure they could not stop loading, working on damage they could not fully assess because proper diagnostic inspection would have required closing the bridge to traffic on a schedule dictated not by engineering judgment, but by how fast the pontoon and treadway bridges could be completed downstream. On the night of March 10, as the battalion was beginning work on a Bailey Bridge section at the near shore to allow two-way traffic on the approaches, a direct German artillery hit killed Major James Foley, the battalion's executive officer, and wounded 19 of the men working around him. Rust kept working. His men kept working. The battle on the surface of the river was matched by a second battle running beneath it. German engineers were sending floating mines downstream toward the bridge. Explosive-laden boats were dispatched under cover of darkness. 7 German frogmen from an SS naval demolitions unit, equipped with Italian underwater breathing apparatus, and dispatched at the personal direction of Special Operations Commander Otto Skorzeny, entered the Rhine to plant charges on the pontoon bridges. The Americans had prepared for exactly this. Net and log booms were strung across the river upstream to intercept floating objects. Tank-mounted searchlights illuminated the water surface after dark. Depth charges were dropped at regular intervals through the night to discourage swimmers. 2 of the 7 frogmen died of hypothermia in the river. 2 more were killed by American fire. 3 were captured. None completed their mission. The Germans were simultaneously throwing their air force at the bridge in what became the most intense anti-aircraft battle in the history of the American military. The Luftwaffe began its aerial campaign within 48 hours of the capture. The initial waves consisted of conventional aircraft, Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, attacking in repeated strikes. The steep ridgelines of the Rhine Gorge on both sides of the crossing forced every German pilot into a narrow approach corridor, funneling them directly into the American anti-aircraft positions on the riverbanks and the surrounding heights. The American air defense built with remarkable speed. By March 9, 5 anti-aircraft battalions were ringing the crossing, running from quadruple 50-caliber machine gun mounts at the river's edge up to 90mm guns on the hills above the town. On March 10 alone, that defense shot down 28 of 47 attacking German aircraft in a single day. By March 13, the concentration had reached 16 gun batteries and 33 automatic weapons batteries, a total of 672 individual weapons covering a single target, a density the Army's subsequent studies identified as the highest anti-aircraft concentration over any single point in the entire Second World War. When conventional aircraft losses became unsustainable, the Germans sent something that had never been used to attack a ground target before. They sent jets. The Arado R-234 V-2 was the world's first operational jet bomber, powered by 2 Junkers turbojet engines that gave it a speed approaching 700 km per hour in level flight, faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter could pursue in a straight chase. By the time of Remagen, approximately 40 of these aircraft had been organized into a specialist strike unit called Gefechtsverband Kowalewski, drawn from the 3rd Group of Kampfgeschwader 76. They were escorted by Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter bombers, Germany's most advanced interceptor, reassigned in the fighter-bomber role for this operation. Each Arado carried a 1,000-kilogram bomb, more than sufficient to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge with a direct hit. Between March 9 and March 17, the Luftwaffe flew 367 recorded sorties against the Remagen crossing. On March 13, 19 Arado jet bombers flew alongside their Messerschmitt escorts in what was the first attack in aviation history, where both the striking force and its escort consisted entirely of jet aircraft. The anti-aircraft guns and the narrow gorge worked against the German pilots at every altitude. At high speed, the jets could not bomb accurately enough. When they came down low to improve their aim, the guns tore them apart. Not one German bomb struck the Ludendorff Bridge during the entire aerial campaign. Captain Don Bryan of the 328th Fighter Squadron was returning from a bomber escort mission at altitude on March 14 when he spotted an Arado pulling out of a bombing run on the pontoon bridge south of the Ludendorff. Bryan had encountered Arado jets 3 times before and watched each of them accelerate away from his P-51 Mustang in level flight. He had worked out that the only way to catch one was to wait for it to turn. When this one banked away from the bridge after releasing its bomb, Bryan got the angle, closed the distance, and shot it down. It was the first air-to-air kill of an Arado R-234 in the war. Nothing the Germans sent through the air touched the bridge, and then Hitler redirected his ballistic missiles at it. The V-2 rocket had been developed at Peenemünde under Werner von Braun and General Walter Dornberger, deployed operationally in the autumn of 1944 against London and Antwerp, and had been striking Allied cities for months by the time of Remagen. It carried roughly a metric ton of high explosive, flew at supersonic speed, and arrived without any audible warning. There was no interception possible once one was in flight. It was the most technically sophisticated weapon on Earth in March of 1945. It had never been aimed at a tactical battlefield target. A bridge 270 meters across a river was not what the weapon had been designed to hit. Its guidance system produced accuracy measured in kilometers, not meters, adequate for area bombing of cities but not for a precise strike against a specific span of steel over a specific river. SS Artillery Abteilung 500, operating from launch sites at Hellendoorn in the occupied Netherlands, fired 11 V-2 rockets toward Remagen on Hitler's direct orders. The closest impact landed approximately 270 meters from the bridge, striking a building on the western side of Remagen that served as the battalion command post of the 284th Engineer Combat Battalion. The blast killed 3 men and wounded 30 others. Everyone working near the bridge that day felt it in the ground beneath their feet, a shockwave that moved through the earth before any sound arrived. The bridge itself was untouched. Private John Morgado, working with the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion during these days, later described what it was like to be on the bridge when a V-2 hit nearby. There was no warning, he said. The ground simply moved. Then a sound. Then you looked around to see what was still there, and who was not. The engineers did not stop working. That is the fact most often missing from the accounts of Remagen that focus on the infantry assault of March 7. The crossing was not decided in the 15 minutes it took Timmermann's company to run across the bridge. It was decided over 10 days by men in hard hats and work gloves, repairing a structure that was being simultaneously bombed from the air, shelled by artillery, struck by V-2 shockwaves, targeted by floating mines, and degraded by the continuous weight of the traffic it was being asked to carry. Every day they kept it standing was another day of divisions crossing, another day of the bridgehead deepening beyond the point where it could be rolled back. On March 9, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin began constructing a steel treadway bridge approximately 400 meters downstream from the Ludendorff. They worked in full view of German artillery observers on the eastern bank, and shells were falling on the construction site almost from the moment they began. The forward end of the growing span, where the floating sections were being attached, was named Suicide Point by the engineers building it. A German shell scored a direct hit there around 1 in the afternoon of March 9, killing 1 man and wounding 5 others. The engineers reorganized around the casualties and continued. By the evening of March 10, approximately 36 hours after construction had begun, the treadway bridge was complete. More than 1,000 feet of floating steel across the Rhine River, built by men who had been under direct observed artillery fire for most of those 36 hours, carrying traffic from the moment it opened. It was the first Allied bridge across the Rhine in the entire Second World War. On March 12, with the treadway and pontoon bridges both operational and carrying the bulk of the traffic, Rust closed the Ludendorff for the structural work it had needed since March 7. His engineers went after the damaged upstream truss with cutting torches and replacement cable, working around the clock. But the damage to the bridge by that point was not something replacement hardware could address in any complete sense. Every artillery impact, every aerial detonation in the gorge, every V-2 shockwave, every hour of continuous heavy vehicle traffic since March 7 had added cumulative fatigue to a structure already compromised at its most critical joint before the crossing even began. Rust knew it. He kept working because the alternative was not working, and not working meant the bridge fell on its own schedule rather than theirs. On March 15, the bridge was reopened to traffic. At 3 in the afternoon of March 17, Rust was walking the center of the Ludendorff Bridge, inspecting the previous night's repair work, when he heard a sharp crack above him. He looked up and saw a vertical hanger pulling away from the truss. He heard a second crack behind him. The deck trembled. Dust rose from every joint in the structure. Rust turned and ran. He was running uphill by the time he reached mid-span, because the eastern end of the bridge had already dropped faster than the section beneath him. Within seconds he was in the Rhine. Private Morgado, standing near the western edge of the bridge at that moment, watched the collapse happen in the time it takes to exhale. He later said the noise was the worst part. Not the sound of the steel, but the sound of the men on the bridge going into the water with it. Men he knew, carrying tools, in full gear, going into a river running at full winter strength. Rust and his companion were pulled from the Rhine at the treadway bridge downstream, shaken but largely unhurt. Rust would later write in his report that the primary cause of the collapse was the break in the bottom cord of the upstream truss from the German demolition charge of March 7. That break had forced the downstream truss to carry the entire structural load for 10 days. The strain had been compounded by the weight of the timber decking his men had added to protect the roadway, by the continuous vehicle traffic between March 7 and 12, and by the vibration and shockwave damage from 10 days of sustained German bombardment. The bridge, he concluded, had been rotten throughout from the moment the Americans captured it. It had held as long as it held because the men working on it had delayed its failure, not because it was ever structurally capable of what it was being asked to do. 6 men of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion were killed when the bridge went down. 11 were missing and presumed drowned in the current. 60 were injured, 3 so severely they later died. Major William Carr, commanding officer of the 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group, was also killed. 7 of his men were listed as missing. Of the 28 American engineers who died when the Ludendorff collapsed, 18 were never recovered from the Rhine. Their names are in the battalion records. They are almost entirely absent from the histories that describe the battle they made possible. The bridge had stood for 10 days. It had stood long enough. Hitler's response to losing Remagen was fury of a kind, his generals later described as unlike anything they had previously witnessed. He ordered a flying court-martial to try the officers responsible. Of the 6 men brought before it, 5 were convicted and sentenced to death. Friesenhahn, who had done everything technically possible with the materials his own army had given him, was acquitted. Of the 5 convicted, Captain Willy Brachy had already become an American prisoner of war and was sentenced in absentia. He survived the war in Allied captivity. The other 4 were taken into the Westerwald forest and shot. The executions produced a consequence Hitler had not anticipated: a paralyzing fear of being the next officer held responsible for a bridge left standing swept through the German command structure. Commanders at every level began destroying crossings they still operationally needed, blowing bridges ahead of schedule and without tactical justification, to ensure that no court-martial could ever be convened over their name and a bridge. The Wehrmacht began systematically denying itself the river crossings its own retreating forces required. That self-inflicted disorder accelerated the speed of the Allied advance through Germany in the final weeks of the war. On the Allied side, the Remagen crossing forced a strategic recalculation that changed the shape of the war's end. Eisenhower altered his operational plans to fully exploit the bridgehead. The unexpectedly early crossing allowed the Allies to position forces for the encirclement of the Ruhr weeks ahead of any previous planning estimate. The Ruhr pocket, completed in early April, trapped 317,000 German soldiers, the largest surrender of German forces on the Western Front in the entire war. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, would later say the Remagen crossing had materially hastened the end of the war in Europe. The breakout from the bridgehead on March 25, 18 days after Timmermann's company ran onto the bridge, opened the road into the German interior. None of this had been planned. None of it emerged from a deliberate strategic vision. It came from a chain of decisions made by men at every level who looked at a situation they had not been briefed for and acted on what they saw in front of them. Engerman did not halt at the ridge and request new orders. He pushed Timmermann's company toward the bridge. Hoge did not wait for authorization he could not have received in time. He committed to the crossing and reported what he was doing as he did it. Timmermann did not look at the open water on either side of a partially demolished bridge and find a reason to stop. He asked one question, and then he went across. Russ did not declare the bridge structurally insufficient and pull his men back to wait for more resources. He assessed the minimum necessary and started there, with what he had, under conditions that would have justified stopping entirely. Pergrin's engineers at Suicide Point did not halt construction when German artillery killed and wounded men at the working edge. They reorganized around the casualties and kept laying treadway. After Company C of the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion was finally relieved by the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, the outgoing men put up a handwritten sign on one of the bridge towers before they left. It said, "In full, cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of the 9th Armored Division." No officer above the rank of the men who painted it had approved it. It was made by soldiers who had spent 48 hours on a damaged bridge in a river gorge under fire and had decided that a joke was the correct way to mark what they had done. Karl Timmermann went to Paris on leave in the weeks after the crossing and learned from a Stars and Stripes newspaper that he was both a hero and a father. His daughter Gay Diane had been born on February 28, 1945, 8 days before he led his company onto the bridge. He had not been able to receive word at the front. He came home to Nebraska in October of 1945, re-enlisted, served in Korea, and died at Fitzsimons Army Hospital in Denver on October 21, 1951. He was 29 years old. He is buried at Fort Logan National Cemetery in Colorado. There is a park in West Point, Nebraska that carries his name. Sergeant Alexander Drabik went home to Holland, Ohio after the war. He worked as a butcher, the same trade he had been in before the army. He did not seek recognition and did not get much of it. He died in an automobile accident in September of 1993 on his way to a reunion of his unit. He was 82 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Clayton Rust survived the Rhine. His after-action report on the structural failure of the Ludendorff Bridge remains one of the most technically detailed engineering documents produced during the entire European campaign. In it, he attributed the collapse to the combination of the broken bottom cord from the March 7 demolition, the fatigue of continuous heavy traffic over 10 days, the cumulative shockwave damage from German artillery and bombing, and the additional weight of the timber decking his own engineers had added to protect the roadway. He was describing, in plain engineering language, a structure that had been partially destroyed on the day it was captured, subjected to sustained attack for 10 days, repaired under fire by men who had neither adequate equipment nor adequate time, and that had refused to fall until it had done what it needed to do. Today, the stone towers on the western bank of the Rhine at Remagen still stand. The bridge itself has been gone since 3 in the afternoon of March 17, 1945. Since 1980, the surviving towers have housed the Peace Museum Bridge at Remagen, dedicated to the history of the crossing. Standing inside those towers and looking east across the water, you are looking at empty space where for 10 days there existed a structure that should have been destroyed before any of this happened, that was structurally broken the moment it was taken, that was being demolished from the outside for every hour of its existence as an Allied crossing, and that held because the men on it would not let it fall until they were done with it. The bridge was named for a German general. It was built by Russian prisoners. It was captured by a lieutenant born in Frankfurt am Main, running across it with men from Nebraska and Ohio and every other corner of a country his father had found his way back to. It was kept open by combat engineers who worked through the nights on something they knew was failing under their feet. And it fell on the 10th day, taking 28 of the men who had kept it standing down into the Rhine after it had already done everything that had been asked of it. The Germans threw the most sophisticated weapons they possessed at a bridge defended by men with welding torches and wrenches. The men with welding torches and wrenches won. There is no monument at Remagen to the engineers of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, or the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, or the 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group. There is no monument to Major James Foley, killed by artillery on the night of March 10 while his men were working in the dark. There is no monument to the 18 engineers the Rhine kept. Their names are in the records of their battalions. Their work is in the outcome. If your father or grandfather served in an engineer unit in the Second World War, in any theatre, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What crossing? What did they remember about the work? Those specific details are the record the official histories cannot hold, and they belong to the people who carry them. The bridge stood for 10 days because men at every level made decisions they were not authorized to make, in situations nobody had prepared them for, in a river gorge in Germany, in the early days of March 1945. That is not something that can be planned into existence. It has to be lived into existence by specific people in specific moments, and it is worth remembering precisely because it was not inevitable, and because most of the men who made it happen went home afterward and did not talk about it much, and are running out of people to remember them.